Good evening. I'm Ian Wardropper, Director of the Frick. Glad to welcome you to a lecture co-sponsored by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, and I thank Peter Leyden, its president, for his support and the members who are present tonight. I'm delighted to be able to introduce the speaker, Giles Waterfield, though I must confess it's not easy to summarize a career that includes roles as art historian, museum director, trustee, exhibition curator, scholar, lecturer, and novelist. Let's start with his academic credentials: Eton, Oxford, Courtauld Institute of Art. Fairly soon thereafter, he became the first director of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, where he remained from 1979 to 1996. Audiences at the Frick know this superb collection from the exhibition Masterpieces of European Painting from the Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2010, and it is well worth visiting when you're in London. Some of the exhibitions he organized or books he wrote during his tenure there, notably on the gallery's designer John Soane, called Soane and After of 1987, Palaces of Art, Art Galleries in Britain, 1790 to 1990 of 1991, and Art for the People of 1994, indicate his interests in architecture, interiors, and the culture of museums in Britain. Towards the end of his time at Dulwich, he took on more of a role as educator, and since 1994 was joint director of the Addingham Summer School until 2003, an important and influential training ground for those interested in the decorative arts and country houses. Since 1995, he was also director of Royal Collection Studies, which brings together distinguished curators and scholars to lecture to specialists about the extraordinary holdings of the monarchy. During this time, he curated Art Treasures of England at the Royal Academy of Art, London, 1998. In Celebration, The Art of the Country House at Tate Gallery, 1998-99. And Below Stairs, the National Portrait Gallery in London, and later in Edinburgh, 2003-2004. He's also someone whose judgment is trusted. This has led to his appointment as a consultant to or a trustee of an astonishing number of institutions and agencies. Just to name a few: the National Trust for England and Wales, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, expert advisor to museums, libraries, and archives of the Heritage Lottery Fund. That was from 1996 to 2000. For the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art from 2002 to 2007. And I'm barely breaking the surface here of the many positions that he's held. Amidst all these activities, to keep himself and us entertained, he has written 4 novels. My favorite title was The Hound in the Left-Hand Corner of 2002, and most recently, The Iron Necklace, 2015, all good ways to distract those of us interested in the arts. Needless to say, his family is equally intriguing, and I remember fondly a visit to a house in the south of France with a famous and charmingly eccentric garden, which he described in his first novel, The Long Afternoon. But it is his most recent academic publication, which has brought him here tonight, The People's Galleries, Art Museums and Exhibitions in Britain, 1800 to 1914, published by Yale University Press last year. Drawing on that, his lecture is A Mirror to the Frick, the Collector Museums of Britain, 1870 to 1920. I'm happy to say that the bookstore will be open after the lecture if you wish to purchase his book, and that the West Gallery will be open for half an hour after the lecture if you want to look at some of the grand pictures which Frick collected, and think about those collected in Britain. Also, I'm happy to say that this lecture is being broadcast live and will be archived on our website. Now, please welcome Giles Waterfield.
Thank you very much for those kind words. What I want to do today is to just tell you what I'm not going to talk about, which is my recent book, just give a little taster, as it were. I decided that rather than speak about regional museums in 19th century Britain, which is I thought perhaps might not thrill a New York audience. I might talk about the relatively small element of that book which relates more closely to the Frick in the complex field of museums in 19th century Britain, which resembles and in many ways differs from the history in this country. There is this particular strand, and I have tried to identify the 5 or so museums which in the constitution and manner of foundation resemble this magnificent place, and yet, as you will see, differ from it as well. The museums that I've principally concentrated on this book are the result, in many ways, of the Industrial Revolution, of the extraordinary explosion in technology, production, wealth in Britain in the 19th century. I show you here a view of Manchester, a city that both fascinated and repelled people in the 19th century from all over the world. You see here a very telling juxtaposition in this print from a popular newspaper of, on the one hand, the great ranks of smokestacks belching smoke over the landscape, and cowering, as it were, beneath them, little houses for the workers and even smaller people walking down the streets. A place like Manchester was both immensely wealthy and productive, and on the other hand, extremely unhealthy. Both, it was thought, from a moral point of view and from a physical point of view, and prone to outbreaks of cholera. And I would see the creation of these museums that I have concentrated on in my book as a direct result of the social conditions that such a place engendered. And it was a very clear correlation was made between, on the one hand, the appalling living conditions and the appalling moral standards of the workers in these places, and on the other hand, the benefits that a museum, an art gallery, the possibility to learn, to appreciate, to experience other things could have upon the working population. This sort of idea was supported by the writings of a man like Samuel Smiles, father, it seems to me, of the business manual, who encouraged people to think that if they too worked hard, they too could succeed. And that is really one of the abiding principles of these quite moralistic galleries, and which were supported by a whole range of people. And I show you just one example of this rather endearing character, Henry Willett of Brighton, seen here with his granddaughter. Henry Willett was an ardent liberal, a member of Parliament, a collector. He used to lecture to large audiences, several thousand strong, of working men. He gave his collection of political tracts to Brighton Reference Library, and he also formed a collection of ceramics that illustrated the whole history of Britain from the earliest days to the present through pots. And this was intended specifically to appeal to a working class audience. And that's really the sort of main strand of my of the book, this new invention of a new type of gallery that was intended for a new type of public. Here you can see some analogous institutions. This is, as you see, Saturday night at a free public library. The library movement in the United Kingdom, as I'm sure in the United States, marches in parallel with the museum movement. And in this view of Liverpool Museum, you can see happy people, happy working men, not women really, borrowing books, reading newspapers, and spending an instructive Saturday afternoon, please note, reading instructive works in the reference library. What is the message of this? The message is that this is the way that men should spend that time, rather than the alternative, which was going to the public house and becoming hopelessly drunk. At the same time, the public park developed in a very active way, and I show you here the opening of Birkenhead Park in the 1840s. first public park of its time, designed by Joseph Paxton of the Crystal Palace. An enormous space with winding serpentine lakes and temples, as you can see, other buildings, bowling greens, cricket pitches, tennis lawns, and so on and so forth. Here it is opening on the opening day, attended by 10,000 people, and this again was intended to provide a healthy alternative to the public house and its attendant evils. And as art museums opened, so did public parks right across Britain. Again, the history is very similar, I think, in the United States, and it might be of interest that Olmsted visited this park soon after it was opened and was greatly influenced by it in designing Central Park. In this strand, I've given quite a lot of attention to exhibitions, because it seems to me that the role of the temporary exhibition, not actually in the history of this kind of museum, but in the history of many art museums, has been somewhat undervalued. The great exhibition of 1851, which attracted 6 million people, unprecedented success, was followed shortly afterwards by the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition, which was organized by the leading citizens of Manchester as a means of trying to establish the fact that Manchester was not just a collection of money-grubbing businessmen, but a place that could organize the most elevated cultural events. It was an exhibition organized in the space of a year, and that included 16,000 exhibits. And if you talk to curators today, who fuss about exhibitions with 30 exhibits organized over 4 years, it is rather remarkable how immensely possible it was to put together such an exhibition entirely drawn from British collections and intended to celebrate the entire history of British art as defined at that time. In Britain, as I think here, the main thrust of the opening of civic galleries outside the capitals took place from the late 1860s up to the First World War, a little bit after that. And this book in 1888 records the fact that already something like 150 natural history, archaeology museums and so on, but only 12 or 15 art galleries. They really come in the later stage. But in this building in Birmingham, you get a sense of the kind of style of such a place. This is the interior of the gallery at Birmingham, the Italian gallery it was called, and it gives a very clear impression of the purpose of such a place, that it was intended not so much to recreate or to encourage studies in the history of art and design. It was more intended to follow the precepts of the South Kensington Museum and to give the public the idea of to give the public, and particularly manufacturers and craftsmen, an understanding of the best qualities of design. And so here you see in these South Kensington cases, as they were known, large numbers of examples, both replicas and originals, mostly sent from South Kensington, of the best metalwork of the past, Birmingham being a great city for metalwork. In Nottingham, great city for lace making, they sent examples of fine lace of the past, because it was felt that the standards of production in Britain were much lower than the standards of design, as a result of which British found it difficult to export works of art. And I believe this kind of museum, much influenced, much copied in Vienna and many other cities in Europe, was also extremely influential for some years in the United States. So Michael Conforti tells me that this particular model of the instructive replica was superseded quite soon by something else. Very briefly, I show you the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, one of our greatest regional art museums, opened in 1877, and originally containing only one work of art, which was a statue of the founder, Alderman Walker, which, though impressive, might not have attracted many repeat visits. The reason was that this was an exhibition space. It was a Kunsthalle, and in these halls they held an annual autumn exhibition and many other events. Kelvin Grove, Glasgow, 1890s, again resulting from a huge temporary exhibition which paid for this extraordinary building, the Harris Art Gallery, just to give you an impression of these mighty places at a time when Lancashire and Yorkshire were immensely rich. Just to dash through the type of collection, and I really illustrate these because they are on the whole so different to the type of collections one finds in the sort of museums I'm principally going to be talking about. Pre-Raphaelites acquired to some modest extent, this is from Manchester, Holman Hunt, but not so broadly. On the whole, collectors preferred narrative pictures, such as Eames's When Did You Last See Your Father? A precursor, I would say, of the cinema. And if you're not familiar with this work, it was always immensely popular, and it shows the Roundheads, the wicked Roundheads, questioning a little boy from a noble house, watched by his mother. What is he going to say? Is he going to give away the fact that Daddy is behind the wainscot? Sister about to be interrogated, tearful older sister, etc. You read the emotions and you assess the reactions and the nature of these men. Are they kindly? Are they cruel? Etc. It's great pre-cinema visual entertainment. Again, this kind of work. When this was shown in a slide lecture in Manchester in 1906, the audience, simple folk for the most part, as the Observer recorded, burst into spontaneous applause, but I've noticed you've not followed suit. It shows old ladies in a workhouse and spoke to the condition of this audience. And this was one of the most copied and popular pictures at the Walker Art Gallery in the 1870s, or 1880s, actually. I think I make my point. You don't need me to say it's lovely, it's great, isn't it? You know, all of us really like this kind of picture, but don't like to say so. So here we have these large audiences, enormously popular galleries, attracting Birmingham, which had a population of around 1 million, regularly had 1.5 million visitors to the City Art Gallery per annum. Enormously popular till about 1900. And if you want to know why visitor figures went down, you can read my book. Okay, so having discussed that, I want to talk a little bit about the whole principle of the collection museum. My intention today is to concentrate on a different, if chronologically parallel, type of museum. This type has been defined by Professor Anne Higonnet as the collection museum, of which the Frick is surely a prime example. Such museums are founded on the basis of personal collections and are generally housed in the founder's former residence or private gallery. They were usually endowed by the founders, in Britain always inadequately. They bore their name and were always stamped, generally stamped, with the founder's personality. They flourished at the same time that the bulk of major civic art museums were set up, that's to say between 1870 and the 1920s. They were created in many countries in the later 19th century, notably in the United States, in France, in Britain, in Spain, and in a rather different form of the preserved artist's house, another interesting theme, in Italy, though surprisingly there are few, if any, examples in Germany. I would emphasize the importance of the building as part of the whole concept, at a time when the idea of constructing museum interiors in the style of the collections they contained was being explored in many national and civic museums. To a great extent, in a collection museum, the building is a crucial element, sometimes the grounds as well. What also emerges is an element of a shared taste, notably the elevation of the decorative arts from the status of furnishings or illustrations of standards of good design, as at Birmingham, to works of art in their own right, arguably equal to or more important than the paintings beside which they stand. This trend of the collection museum is anticipated by the personal museums of the early 19th century. Such men as Sir John Soane, whom you see here, and the brothers William Hunter, very sophisticated portrait, and John Hunter, more tortured and romantic, both outstandingly successful and wealthy doctors, all bequeathed collections that were intended to form museums. For the Hunters, the bequest of their collections to medical foundations, respectively in Glasgow and in London, was on the one hand intended to further medical research, but was also intended as a form of self-perpetuation, so that William left to Glasgow University not only his enormous medical teaching collection, but his notable works of art. For Soane, the museum was intended to instruct young architects in the practice of their profession, an aim, ironically, that it's only realized in the late 20th century. These museums were distinguished by their learned and pedagogical qualities, inspired by their founders' researches into medicine, architecture, the classical world, or fine art, and their desire to communicate this knowledge. The visitor might be invited to contemplate, as here I think, the passing of ancient civilizations and the brevity of life, and to enter a zone laden with associations. I see these museums as distinguished from later collection museums, however, by their specific didactic qualities, and at least at the Soane Museum, by their invitation to meditate on life's brevity. That is, after all, not the emotion aroused by the Frick collection. Still, such a vision as Gandhi's depiction of the works of his master, John Soane, enclosed within a sonic space, does look forward to the notion of a building which serves as a three-dimensional biography of its founder. A similar image of the intimate relationship between the character and aspirations of a museum and the objects within it may be found in the self-portrait famous by Charles Wilson Peale, commissioned by the trustees of the Philadelphia Museum for the museum that he had himself founded and filled with symbolic allusions. I don't have time to discuss all the influences upon the founders of collection museums, but I would suggest that their character derives obviously from the personal tastes of the individuals, but also from tastes that were culturally determined. Art dealers, as well as interior designers and architects, clearly played a great part. The Devines are notable leaders in this field, but also prominent was Stefano Bardini. Bardini was an artist, restorer, and art dealer, notably in the field of Italian Renaissance art. He collaborated closely with Bernard Berenson, and many paintings and sculptures now in American museums, the Met, the Isabella Stewart Gardner National Gallery, derive from him. In 1881, he acquired a convent in Florence and converted it into a residence, restoration studio, showplace, and ultimately a museum opened to the public in 1823 after his death. And there you see the current appearance of the Museo Bardini, unfortunately rather cleaned up, but it does give you an impression of this specially devised space, which seems to me to give a clue to one of the reasons why collections such as this and others have such an important element of Italian Renaissance works. But this was not the only influence. A giant among museum directors and a man of incredible energies, Wilhelm Bode served as director of the Berlin Picture Gallery became the director of the Berlin Picture Gallery in 1890 and of the Prussian State Museums in 1905. He was responsible for the erection of this large building on the edge of the Museums Island, now known as the Bode Museum in his honor in 1904, as the original title. From our point of view, he was, I believe, a very influential figure. His importance lay in his interest in all the arts, so that in the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, he dissolved traditional distinctions between media. There, paintings, sculpture, furniture, ceramics, and other art forms were shown all together in single rooms, their juxtaposition dictated by chronology. Some of his interiors, such as the Renaissance room you see here, were evidently museum-inspired with top lighting and so on, and did not aspire to evoke historical interiors. But in some cases, they have the character of period rooms, old photograph of the Gothic room with pieces of furniture and other items displayed in a quasi-domestic way and with floors, walls, and ceilings modeled on historical prototypes or actually old ones, and side lighting provided through windows rather than skylights. Now, I don't think he actually brought in rooms and recreated them as period rooms, but he assembled elements in these rather extraordinary theatrical presentations. These interiors, and indeed the whole museum, must have created a sense of an enclosed, hermetic world in which the visitor found himself or herself immersed in a universe devised by the curators, where every physical element contributed to the visual and historical experience. Bode exerted a strong influence in the States through such colleagues and pupils as Wilhelm Valentina. Having worked at the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, Valentina moved to the Met and then to Detroit in the 1920s. And at both museums, especially Detroit, period rooms became a prevailing mode of display. Certain modes of taste also shaped many collection museums, which were made in some instances by highly sophisticated artists and collectors, and sometimes by people ready to follow the fashion of their time. There is evidently a pronounced taste for the French 18th century in terms of furniture, ceramics, paintings, and to a lesser extent, bronzes and other sculptures. It is a taste that in Britain at least stretches right through the 19th century. I show you here the grand reception room, completely stunning apartment at Windsor Castle, where George IV was experimenting with recreating a 18th interior with accurate pieces and then with a certain amount of imagination. And in much the same, it wasn't only at court. Here is the wonderful Elizabeth Saloon at Belvoir Castle, created by the Duchess of Rutland in 1826. This taste for the French 18th century continued in the 1830s and 40s because there were many buyers in London who had a lot of money, more money than their opposite numbers in France. And so it was relatively easy to buy works of art and to bring them over to Britain. The most famous example of this kind of taste is, of course, what has become known as the Rothschild taste, the Gül Rothschild. I show you here Waddesdon Manor, but remind you that although this is one of only 2 surviving Rothschild houses, there were 8 or 9 originally in a particular part of Buckinghamshire, all furnished with not quite the splendor of Waddesdon, but something pretty comparable. This house was created between 1874 and 1889 by a French architects playing quite a part in this story in Britain, for Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild. And I show you just one view. This is the founder's room, or the baron's room, as it's called, with taste for 18th century English portraits, which became the absolute top hitters in the art market for a relatively brief period in the late 19th, early 20th century, fueled by the Devines, and then some indications of the taste for the French 18th century, which is so prevalent here. There is a sort of slightly creepy quality. I now show you the next slide. Please note this chair. Well, you may not find it creepy. This chair, this sofa, this thing, whatever it is, this object. Here is the Baron, and there is the chair and the sofa and the thing. The dog is gone, and the Baron's gone, sadly, too. But what I think is quite interesting about this, and it's a theme that is very much in my mind, and I find constantly fascinating, is how far such a place should and can profitably recall habitation and the individual characteristics and tastes and nature of the owners, of the people who live there. And looking across the whole spectrum, there is a very wide disparity between places where the personality of the founder is reduced to one portrait, and places that are presented more or less as though they were inhabited dwellings, with the Frick, I'd say, somewhere in the middle, that spectrum. In France, a revived taste for the 18th century was fueled by the Second Empire and by the need, as Sarah Medlam has put it, to validate the newly rich society in France by reference to the pre-French Revolution taste, as seen in the cult of Marie Antoinette enjoyed by the Empress Eugénie. Reproductions of various Louis styles became standard for grand interiors in France, in London, and, as you know well, in the United States. And by the 1880s and 90s, the architectural style had spread to the generality of rich taste. The same applied to many, but by no means all, collection museums. On the one hand, these offer particularly splendid and well-preserved examples of fashionable taste of the period, but they also include outstanding examples of work by noted cabinet makers or ceramicists. I'm going to show you rapidly one or two examples. So here we have the Musée Jacquemart-André, founded by André, a man of wealth, and his wife, Nellie Jacquemart, an artist. They were not, I think, short of money. They collected very actively. The museum opened in 1913. Strong emphasis on Renaissance art, but also on French and English 18th century art. Here's the interior, where they like to entertain. The Musée Nissim de Camandou is, I think, in context of what I've been saying, a particularly fascinating case. Built in 1911 by Baron Nissim de Camandou, another example of a very active Jewish patron, a building based on the Petit Trianon. It was bequeathed to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in 1935 in memory of his son, and open to the public. It is, on the one hand, as I'm sure you know, an astonishingly notable example of the celebration of French 18th century taste that I've been talking about. And here is one of the interiors shown, you know, pretty much as a room that you could conceivably use. What is also very fascinating about the Nissim de Camandou is the fact that in fairly recent years they've opened the kitchen, which, when it first opened, was not considered appropriate, but actually is very interesting. But what I also find fascinating going there is how one's experience is overshadowed by the fact that in the Second World War, although they'd been promised immunity, the remaining members of the family who were still living in the house were rounded up and taken off to Auschwitz. And if you listen to visitors to this place, that is the aspect that they particularly are struck by, the contrast between this grandeur and elegance of the house and the hideous fate that met some of its owners. Well, you know the Huntington Art Gallery, magnificent example in the same genre, founded in 1919. And I show you very rapidly, because this is, I say, this is a sort of international, cross-Atlantic tendency. I put this in, as I felt you wouldn't want to meet her on a dark night. I love Arabella. She must have been quite a girl. But more seriously, what is very interesting in this story is how important the role of women was. In the history of the regional museums in Liverpool and Manchester, women played an insignificant role. They were not employed as members of staff except as cleaners until the end of the century, never as curators. A few of them were notable patrons because the legal system that didn't allow women to have independent private fortunes unless they were unmarried. But in these partnerships, in the foundation of many of these museums, we find that women played a particularly significant role, and many of the collection museums, as in this case, were very much shaped by the character of the female, of the wife. The very interesting theme, the mausoleum where they're buried. and, as you know, the Great Gallery, recently reinstalled one of the most magnificent examples of the presentation of British painting. However dominant it may have been, France of the 18th century was by no means the only taste. In the Rothschild tradition, the creators of collection museums were highly conscious of what was being acquired by other collectors at a comparable level of wealth and sophistication. They often contain a variety of medieval artifacts, medieval and Renaissance, but seldom classical sculpture, visually appealing old master paintings, Rubens on the whole, rather than Poussin, the newly fashionable English and French 18th century portraits and genre scenes, English and French furniture and ceramics, with Gobelin tapestries, Sèvres in particular demand, and often material associated with the founders. If it was included at all, contemporary art tended to be of the salon type. From such sources derived the collection museums that I am speaking of. They offered a phenomenon from which the erudition and the admonitions of 100 years earlier, the Soane Museum and so on, were generally absent. If any admonition was offered, it was to admire the wealth and taste of those who had assembled such magnificence and whose images presided in perpetual benevolence. Collection Museum has received close attention in recent years, notably from Carol Duncan and Anne Higonnet. Duncan paints a critical picture of donor museums in which works of art are consigned to the purgatory of never again being used as art by anyone else, at least not publicly. I'm not sure that's fair, but still. Higonnet seeks to reconstruct, quote, the ideas that animated the enchantments, the thrill, the magic of these places, analyzing the complex personal history enshrined in, among others, that most egocentric of personal temples, the Isabella Stewart Gardner. As these writers have discussed, the characteristic collection museum often serves as a memorial to the founder or founders or to a deceased spouse or relation. I want now to consider rapidly, in chronological order, rather than order of importance, the British examples, only 5. In some cases, these will be familiar to you. In others probably not. They range from the local to the internationally dominant. I'll illustrate them individually and then make some general remarks. The Holman of Menstrie Museum was bequeathed to Bath by its creator's sister, in 1882. Originally housed in a private house in Bath, it's this house, which is sizable, 3 bays wide, but not enormous. It contained the possessions of Sir William Holman, a minor aristocrat, but obsessive collector. Having inherited Chinese armorial porcelain, silver, and portraits, he added silver and porcelain, Italian maiolica and bronzes, old master paintings, portrait miniatures, books, and furniture, all kept in a large private house in Bath. When bequeathed to the people of Bath, the collection moved first to a temporary building, which you see here, which gives a very good feeling of its character, like a sort of chamber of curiosities, another view of its first home, and then to a former hotel converted for the purpose where it remains. Though Sir William was not buying at the top of the market, he assembled interesting old master paintings and some fine English portraits, as well as notable decorative arts. Here is one of the galleries as it looks now, and you get a feeling of the sort of enormous volume of material, and another of the rooms has recently been reinstalled. A very different and more ambitious approach was taken in the north of England at Barnard Castle in the Bowes Museum. This museum was set up by John and Josephine Bowes. He was a wealthy, but not extremely wealthy man, the illegitimate son of the Earl of Strathmore. He was kind of half illegitimate in a way I can tell you later if you're interested. Bowes had met his French wife, Josephine, when she was working as an actress in Paris, and she played a very active part in the formation of the collection, which included many of her quite talented paintings. From 1869, a French Renaissance chateau, which you've seen, was erected to the designs of another French architect, Jules Pellichet, but only completed 4 years later, in 1892, when the museum opened, they had perpetual financial problems. The startlingly incongruous building is surrounded by French-style gardens, as you see, and contains an outstanding collection of pictures, especially strong in Spanish works. Here is the entrance hall as it looked when the place first opened. It's less opulent than they had hoped for because the money ran out at a certain stage and they had to do the best with what they could, but they did make an astonishing collection. It's also very rich in furniture and in ceramics, and it has a large collection of period rooms. I show you the entrance hall as it looks today. Having been through many financial tribulations, it's now on pretty good standing. And here is one of the three picture galleries at the top of the building, which do not hold back in their vigor and the number of works. And it is very unlike the collection, the municipal museums that I was showing. It doesn't have contemporary work on the whole, except Josephine Bowes. It has old masters, and it's very wide-ranging in terms of school. And to collect Spanish paintings was actually pretty uncommon at the time. The Bowes Museum asserts the ancestral links of its founder, being close to the center of the family estates, while proudly stating its distinctiveness in a stately pile that is a sort of Gallicized County Durham answer to the castles of Ludwig of Bavaria. Of the British collection museums, the Wallace collection is certainly the best known. So this is the swan, the wonderful 18th century silver swan created by Mr. Cox for Cox's Museum in 1760 or so, and still functioning. It's worth going there to see this. The collections of the third and fourth Marquesses of Hertford were much enhanced by the fourth Lord Hertford's illegitimate son, again, Richard Wallace, who died in 1890. His widow left the collections to the nation, and it opened to the public in 1900 in Hertford House, and this must be a contemporary postcard. In a number of ways, it is an unusual example of the collection museum. It does not result from the collecting of one individual, but of several, and most significantly, it was never intended by Lady Wallace that it should remain in Hertford House. So the idea of personal memorialization does not apply here in quite the way that it does in other museums. Equally, when it became a museum, the personal domestic fittings were removed. I think this is a fairly regular procedure, and the decoration was simplified, giving the interiors a more concentrated, more museum-like quality, and removing them from the category of the house museum, to which it has actually lately been restored to some extent. So here we see the backstage room in 1890, when it was filled with works of art and could be visited by people with connections. And here it is after its same room, after it's been made into a museum. Lady Wallace died in 1897, and after substantial museumification, it was opened to the public in 1900. I'll show you one or two other examples. This is the Reynolds room in 1897, and you can see there is still a domestic quality to this room. All these minor pieces of sort of usable furniture and the fireplace and so on were removed to give it a more stark museum-like quality. Or the Great Gallery, already in 1890, had something of a museum-like appearance. On its opening, the Wallace collection was greatly admired for its, in Britain and internationally, I believe, for its success in bringing together sculpture, furniture, ceramics, paintings, and other media in a harmonious but correct and scholarly whole in a way that had not previously been seen, at least in Britain, and I think not widely elsewhere. And I don't know as much as I should about the international influence of the Wallace, but I think it was probably considerable. This tradition continued into the 20th century in Britain with the Russell Coates Museum and the Lady Lever Art Gallery, where both, incidentally, the male owners paid tribute to Napoleon. hero of the self-made man, and apparently much adored by many American businessmen at a certain stage, particularly if they were rather small. And I'm not joking, it's true. The Russell Coates Art Gallery, which you see here, and museum was set up in 1980 in East Cliff Hall, the, quote, spacious home of comfort and beauty built by Sir Merton Russell Coates, a hotelier who had served as mayor of Bournemouth, seaside town, south of England. Unlike most other founders of museums, Russell Coates was swayed by commercial considerations. A museum, in his view, should be set up with the commercial aim of attracting tourists, partly intended to illustrate his hatred of certain modern art forms, such as post-impressionism. The House Museum would also promote the town by, quote, inducing the patronage of visitors to a health resort because of there being at that time no attraction whatsoever in Bournemouth. So here we see this rather bizarre, sort of oversized seaside villa. There it is as it looks today. There is an old photograph of the staircase hall. Here is the same space seen from below as it looks today, very much intact. Russell Coates was primarily interested in paintings and was on friendly terms with a number of artists, such as Edwin Long. This is one of his paintings, and it's called The Chosen Five, and I think this illustrates its own point, as it were. He was praised for his artistic taste as evidence of his wealth. Quote, wrote a journalist, "It is certain there is not a great number of picture collectors who can afford to have such pictures as an Alma Tadema and a Raffaelli, not Raphael, but Raffaelli, in their collection at the same time." His wife, Annie, concentrated on ethnography and natural history. They combined these interests in their dramatically planned yet deeply suburban house, complete with mosaic hall and Moorish alcove, and liberally adorned with images of themselves. Russell Coates was pleased with the result. In his memoir, Home and Abroad, he quoted the view of Lord Ribblesdale, an acquaintance of his, or so he claimed, that the museum was, quote, a miniature Wallace collection and much more varied in its exhibits. Finally, the Lady Lever Art Gallery. This is the last of my founders, Lord Leverhulme, great man, great businessman. This astonishing gallery opened in 1822. Lord Leverhulme made a great deal of money out of soap, among many other things, created Sunlight soap, and had enormous factories. He was also an impassioned collector who filled several houses with his possessions. This is a particularly fascinating example, both for its collections and because of its location. It stands at the center of the village of Port Sunlight, which was an estate village. He didn't actually live there, but his workers did. And it was a very pleasant place with arts and crafts houses designed by a number of architects, 30 architects, I think, were involved, to the highest standards. And although people living there were somewhat controlled in what they could do, nevertheless, they did enjoy a splendid standard of living. So in this way, he looks back, I think, to the type of philanthropist that I was talking about earlier on. This is the hall where you could, it's now Port Sunlight Museum, but originally the place where you could go and enjoy healthy entertainment, like billiards and snooker, untainted by alcohol. There's no public house. At the very center of this complex stands, and it's all preserved, stands the Lady Lever Art Gallery. This was intended as a memorial to his wife, and who had died sometime earlier, and was opened in 1922. It continued the tradition of grand patronage in the Victorian style into the post-war, First World War period. with, again, its English 18th and 19th century paintings, its representative English furniture of very high quality and of Wedgwood, its classical antiquities and Chinese art, its boldly selected modern British and French sculpture and paintings. It is much more modern than some of the other collections, all housed in an effective building by William and Segar Owen. Here is the principal entrance front, and here it is, slightly more playful, looking on the fountains and the gardens at the back. It's based on an unusual premise that recalls the galleries with which I started. The collections were intended to elevate the sensibilities and improve the lives of the working people who lived all around it. As you will see, in spite of their similarities, each of these collection museums is strongly idiosyncratic. I'll just show you a few examples of the interiors of the Lady Lever. This is a photograph I'm very keen on. This is Princess Beatrice, daughter of Queen Victoria, looking about as bored as a royal person can look, unlocking the Lady Lever, and Lord Leverhulme quite beside himself with excitement. Beside her, and there's an element of vanity in these museums, let us face it. And here they are, all lined up for the opening ceremony. And again, he's just got himself under control here. The building is very unusual and was full of personal traits. He believed that paintings looked to advantage on black walls, and actually they do look very startling on black walls. This is the main hall. You can see the richness of the collection, tapestries, paintings, furniture, etc. He was a very, very skillful collector and not prone to buy things because they were cheap, which is something that some of these collectors are prone to. Here is the 17th century room, something of a jumble, but you can see the sort of mass of objects that he has assembled, again, many of them very high quality and being bought before such things were very regularly being acquired. And the Napoleonic room reflecting his particular passion. There was also a Freemason's room, and there was originally a flat where he could stay if he wanted to, though I think he never actually did. So finally, these museums could scarcely have been more different from municipal galleries in their collections, their displays, or their ambiance of opulent privacy. The emphasis on personal ownership and use is habitual. At the Bowes Museum, an apartment was provided for Josephine Bowes within the building, and most of the furniture on display had been in use at the family's French houses. Such a gallery was to be seen as, quote, the artistic embodiment of a great personality, in which the donor assumed by right of ownership and the highly visible sharing of such ownership an artistic aura, though not the socially dubious associations of actually being an artist. The galleries were intended, of course, to enhance the experience of viewing the work of art, but also to underline the fine taste, the skillful wealth, and the generosity of their owners. On the other hand, it has to be said that most of these owners seem to have been obsessed by collecting, rather than driven by any sense of social obligation to acquire works of art. There was, however, a social agenda to the Collection Museum in the early 20th century, just as there is, perhaps, to its modern successors. Like the entrepreneurs who founded collection museums in Paris, or the railway magnates and robber barons of the United States, British founders tended to derive not from the old aristocracy, but from the fringes of high society, or from new banking or industrial fortunes. The two most spectacular examples, the Bowes Museum and the Wallace Collection, were both created by married couples. In each case, as you've heard, the husband was the illegitimate son of a nobleman at a time when illegitimacy in Britain, I'm sure here too, was seen as a real disgrace for the child, while the wife, in both cases, was a French woman of modest social background. The Wallaces did have a son who had they had a legitimate son. He had 4 illegitimate children, but predeceased his father. The Bowes were under financial pressure for much of their lives, pressure that affected the character of the museum and notably its internal fittings. It's hard not to see social self-justification as well as the creation of a site of memory for two couples without surviving children, as prime motives for the collections and their perpetuation, while the social origins of the two men maybe liberated them from the widely shared predilection for ignorant Philistinism then current in many aristocratic circles in Britain. Easy though it is to deconstruct the motives of the founders of collection museums, and I'm speaking here of all of them, not just the British variety, they devised an exceptionally successful approach to display. Their museums, largely relatively small scale, stamped with individuality, and offering an experience of refined sumptuousness as well as shelter, have become some of the most admired in the Western world. For many museum visitors, and I include myself, a museum that retains a sense of the individual or the individuals who created it is a museum that lives. Thank you very much.